Hello everyone. So I wanted to make a tutorial for making an API using .NET 6, and I was recently inspired by a story that came out of Sweden where some parents were fed up with a poorly written platform for their school's management system. I thought that would be a fun project to build out. So I thought we could start off by building out an API and building it in such a way that makes it easy for people to contribute and expand functionality. And then from there, possibly moving on to a UI wrapped around that API. So as I mentioned, we'll be using .NET 6, and in addition to that, we'll be using Entity Framework Core. So let's get started. So let's begin by setting up the project. I have Visual Studio 2022 installed. Just make sure that you have .NET 6 SDK installed on your machine. We'll need to select ASP.NET Core Web API. So you can go ahead and search for that. And make sure that you choose a C# one. I've already created a GitHub repository where this code will live and be public for all of you. I'm naming my project Open Classroom API, but feel free to name yours whatever you would like. Hit next. And then just leave all of these settings as default. Just make sure that your framework's set to .NET 6. Okay, so the first thing we can do is go ahead and clean up some of this default stuff for the weather forecast. So go ahead and delete that controller and this class. And then one of the first things I like to do is separate my main concerns into individual projects within the solution. I usually start with the data aspect. So let's create a new class library and add EFC to it. And EFC, just so you know, is short for Entity Framework Core. So right click on your solution, add new project, and then we're looking for class library, and make sure you choose C#. Next, and then I always name mine after the root name of the project, and then just add .data to it, like so, and then hit next, .NET 6, and create. Okay, and we're going to need to add a reference to this project from our main project. So right click your main project, add, and then project reference, and then select the project, hit OK. And that just adds it to our dependencies under projects. Okay, so now we can right click our data project and then go to manage Nuget packages. And of course we have nothing installed on that yet, but we're going to browse and we're going to add, well, it's right here at the top for me, but you can search for Entity Framework Core. Go ahead and install the latest. Okay, so the first thing we can do is rename this default class that came with the project to where I'm going to call mine application DB context. Essentially what this is, it's a class that's going to inherit from DB context, which comes from EFC. And this class will basically serve as instructions to EFC on how to build out the SQL database. Alright, and as I said, it's going to inherit from DB context. Whoops. And that comes from EFC. To complete our setup with this DB context, we need to go ahead and build out the constructor and then pass in some options. So application DB context options, and that will take this class itself, okay, and then options is what we'll call it, and then we'll do the base class options. So I'm just going to tab to accept that. Next, we will go ahead and set up our configuration to basically tell the application this is our DB context and this is what you need to use for database connection and whatnot. So let's do that. Okay, so when setting up my configurations, I don't like to have my program file all junked up with stuff, so I like to abstract that out to static methods. And to do that, I usually just create a new folder called configuration. So I'll start off by adding a class called app services. This will be a public static class, and it will have a method in it called public static void. It will be add default services. And then what we're going to be taking in is, so up here where it's adding this add endpoints, API Explorer, and Swagger and stuff, it's coming off of this iService collection. So that's what we will be taking in. From here, that's where we can, I'll just take this stuff and copy that over into here. And this is just going to be, we can take this stuff, instead we can do builder.services.add default services. Okay, so that's the default services that came in, and I am going to add in the database context here. So to do that, we're actually going to need configuration as well. So we'll need iConfiguration. Okay, so to set this up, we will say services.add DB context. Oh yeah, and we'll also need to install the Nuget package inside of this project. So go ahead, take that, install, yes, accept. And we're going to pass in the application DB context that we created. So we'll need to bring that in. Oh, you know what? We need SQL Server. So Entity Framework Core SQL Server, make sure that gets installed. Let's see, we take in options, and then we'll say options.use SQL Server. Okay, that brings in Entity Framework Core. And then this is the configuration for the connection string. So configuration dot get connection string. So we're telling it where to grab the connection string to be able to connect to that database. Default connection. And that's just gonna, this default connection, that's gonna be in our app settings. So we'll plug that in just a moment. And then we're going to tell it that migrations assembly will come from the root namespace for our project, which for me is this. I just need to close that out, which, go. Okay, cool. And then remember we added in this guy, so back in program, it's going to complain because we haven't passed in that configuration. To get that configuration, we take it from builder configuration. And I like to do the same thing with my, so inside a program, we configure the pipeline. To do that, this takes in a web application. So in my configuration folder, I'll add a new class and I'll call it app configuration. And then public static void add default configuration, and that took in, what was it? Web application. This. So we're gonna let it build here and take all of this stuff up until here, and we'll leave this app.run inside of program. Bring that into here. Replace app. And then of course we need to come back in here and then tell it add default configuration. Okay, I'm gonna close all those tabs, and then let's hop back down into our data, and then we'll add in a school object. Since we're making a school management system, we'll need a school object to keep track of that data. I like to create a new folder in my data project called models. And then inside of that, I will create a class called school. Okay, set it as internal, but we're gonna make it public. VS 2022 is recommending this code, which yes, we do want an ID property. However, I'm going to change it to a GUID, and I'm going to tell Entity Framework or that this is the key, and I want it to be auto-generated. So to do that, we add an attribute above, and we say it's a key, and we need to bring in data annotations. And then we are also going to put in database generated. For that, we need to bring in data annotations.schema. And this takes in an option, a database generated option of identity. It's what we will choose. Okay. So now Entity Framework Core will create the table in such a way that this is a key and it's auto-generated. Okay, and then we can just add in some other properties, you know, like the name of the school, address, info, stuff like that. So there we go, string name. Okay, string, sure, it can have a description. Okay, I guess that's all it's going to give me. We'll go with address and city. Whoops. State. Zip code. And that should be good. Okay, it's complaining. Yeah, declare as nullable, that's fine. Now this will represent our school. Entity Framework Core will create all of these columns inside the table for a school for us. So let's head over to application DB context, and we're going to add in a DB set of school. Call it schools, and it's a property. Bring in the models, and we're good. Okay, so now what we can do is we can go ahead and instruct the Entity Framework Core to actually build out that database. And to do that, we'll need to use the package manager console. Now, if this isn't showing up for you down here, you can find it by going into View, Other Windows, and then it will be in here, Package Manager Console, or I think you can search for it up here. So open that guy up. I'm going to clear it out. However, I am remembering now that we do need another Nuget package for this, and it's going to be this guy right here, entity framework core dot tools. So go ahead and install that. Yeah, now I'm remembering too, we need a default connection string. So to do that, we'll go ahead and hop into our app settings. You can expand that and you'll see app settings.development JSON. And we're gonna add in a connection strings, and within that we'll add in a default connection that will be equal to the following. It's basically saying, hey, set up a local database on your own machine. So server equals I always name mine after the project and then the environment. So open classroom API.dev. And this will give us what we need to connect to the database. I think we're good to run our command. So hop on over here. We'll say add migration, and then you name the migration. For this first one, I was just name it initialize. Okay, perfect. So created our migration, and then now with that migration, we can tell entity framework core to update. So update database. Okay, so success. Now, what can we do with this? Let's create a controller that just says, hey, give me a school with an ID of this. So we'll go into our main project. We'll go into controllers. We'll add a new controller. And we are going to create an empty one. We'll call it schools controller. We want to make this controller have an attribute with API controller, as well as tell it what the route is. So route will be, and then we're just going to say that the route's going to be the name of this controller. So to do that, you just say controller inside of these brackets. And then you can also say slash and action. So we're going to change this. Let's create an endpoint called details. So, and this will be a get. So instead of an iAction result, we're going to return an action result. And it's going to be an action result of school. We got to bring in our models, and then we're calling it details, and that's not how you spell details. Okay, and this will take in a GUID called ID. Okay, and of course we're not going to return a view. We're going to return this action result of school. So we're expecting a school, and to get this we need to hook up to our database and retrieve that school. So in our constructor, let's this. In our constructor, we're gonna inject the application DB context. We need to also put it up here. Okay, so now we have access to our application DB context. So what we can do is retrieve the school based on the ID. So we'll say school equals application DB context dot schools, and this is grabbing from that DB set that we created in here, schools. Okay, and then let's just do first or default, because it could be null, like they could have passed in a ID that just doesn't exist in the database. And we're gonna say requirement is that and it already knows that the school ID is equal to the ID up here that they passed in. Okay. And then let's go ahead and check whether school is null. And then if it is null, we'll say it wasn't found. So if school is null, and we'll say return new not found result. In fact, we can make this a little more specific. We can change it to a not found object result, which will require us to put in an object, which I'm going to put in a string. And then otherwise, we'll just return school. Okay. Okay, so I think that should be all we need. Let's try building. Okay, everything succeeded in the build. Let's try running. Okay, so Swagger comes up. It gives us a rundown of our endpoints. So we have schools, and then we have an endpoint called schools details. Let's see, and then we take an ID. Actually, to make this a little more RESTful, because this is a query, instead of schools details and then a query parameter, let's say give it ID. Okay, so okay, a school with an ID of blah 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 was not found. That is it. What we passed in 07 ends with 68. Yep, good there. Strange that it lowercased it. That's fine. We got a 404 back, so it was not found. We see that the route was details slash and then the ID. So okay, so perfect. So that wraps up our first video. Next we'll probably dive into creating a school. Okay, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.